2 days a week I'm a clinical psychologist and I work in a national specialist service for folks with psychosis. 3 days a week I'm an academic in psychiatry. Nicola is an evolutionary biologist who originally did a PhD and postdoc on, was it birds or fishes?
Birds and fishes.
Birds and fishes, but has become really interested in humans. And so we work together because her specialism is cooperation. I'm really interested in psychosis. And so we work together doing lots of social cognition studies on paranoia at the moment, but we're interested in getting people to actually interact. And this is largely due to the dissatisfaction with the kind of current state of affairs in social cognition. So if you follow a lot of social cognition research, you will notice that it's largely static information processing, it's fixed scenarios or problem-solving tasks, and short instances rather than continuing and evolved interactions, where you know it's not a genuine social situation, right? So most people doing social cognition tasks will be showing pictures of faces or things like this. You never think for a moment that that's a real person there. Or the genuine seeming social interaction is faked. So even where you think you're in a social interaction, typically it's faked and you're playing against an algorithm in both conditions. A big part of why these approaches are popular is because you don't need to worry about coordinating more than one person at a time. Right? You can just run one person at a time with like any other lab study, and it's only social in as much as there's social information there. And so they're just like any other non-social experiment, because getting people to cooperate and do things at the same time is a real pain. Also, we're kind of doing mental health research, and we've got lots of problems in mental health research. So firstly is that there's very low statistical power. So there's a really interesting paper that came out recently about the levels of statistical power in different medical specialties. Psychiatry came out top, and we had an average power of 15%. Data and analysis is typically not open, so other people can't see your code or data you've done. Some studies are probably subject to p-hacking. Again, this is no difference from psychology and medicine as a whole. And typically, there's a real kind of people want to put clinical completeness over statistical robustness. So if you look at a lot of clinical science, there'll be studies of like 40 people. They've had like bloods and hormones and neuropsych and imaging and stuff like this, but that doesn't change the fact that there's still n equals 40, and statistically, that's very low powered. They also tend to be poorly representative samples. Obviously, if you're testing kind of n equals 40 people, this is experimental work, right? This is not kind of epidemiology. So we study people while they're interacting. All right, so clearly you need more than one person at once. We do open science, robust research. So we frequently use pre-registration, we publish our data, we publish the analysis code, we publish materials, we use large samples, and typically, because we're getting people to do things in a coordinated fashion, you kind of have to run it online. Right? It just means if you want to fulfill all those criteria, it's pretty much an online component of your study is necessary. So I'm just going to talk about different approaches to doing this. Some of these we've used, some of these we've explored, but really just to get you an idea of the kind of strengths and weaknesses of different ways of doing this. So the first one is ex-post matching. So in other words, we test people asynchronously, in other words, one at a time, and then match people with others who have made a response to this decision. So this typically works well with kind of game theory tasks. I'll give you an example in a minute. Game theory tasks are interesting forms of kind of social exchange with a very structured kind of limitations on the task and a very structured aspect of the strategic interaction. They're good because you know there's only a certain limit of tasks or responses you can give, or you can actually limit them yourself. And so all you need to know is that, well, they're going to give like one of, 100 or one of 5 or one of 10 responses, and hence it's quite easy when you have a big enough pool of people to find someone who's made a response to exactly that turn, right? And you also know that no additional information is missing from the context. In other words, the asynchronous decision is functionally identical to the synchronous decision, right? So people essentially responding to each other's responses, but they're not made at the same time. And in these tasks, it's functionally identical. Let me just give you a quick example. So you may have heard of the ultimatum game. The ultimatum game is where there's a pot of money and there's 2 people and someone decides how to split that money, right? So they could split it 50-50 or they could split it 10-90, but the other person gets a veto on that. So according to classical economics, if someone splits it 99 and 1 to you, you should take the one because you're better off by one than you were before. To the horror of economists, what people do is they go, no, you're being disrespectful, and they'll prefer to receive nothing, and so both people receive nothing, than be dealt with what they can perceive as an unfair offer. Right? So in this task, with ex-post matching, participant A proposes, let's say, 50 cents, and then the software selects a response from someone who has responded to a 50-cent offer and communicates it to participant A. Right? So you can see how in this sort of task, you just have, with enough people, everybody's made the response to every particular offer, and you can just match responses. It's been validated as equivalent to synchronous interaction in game theory, so we know there's no kind of distinction in terms of people's behaviour and so on. Requires no inter-participant live coordination, I should say. Right? So people don't have to be online at the same time. Can be done with online survey software, so you can do it with kind of call tricks and things like this. It's easy to collect data at scale, it's cheap, it's easily reproducible. In other words, we can distribute the materials, the experimental setup we use quite easily, but it's quite limited in terms of interaction possibilities, right? So if you have an interaction space that's big enough, so there's going to be someone who doesn't respond to any particular response, that's a big problem, and as you'll know, in terms of human behaviour, that can happen quite quickly. Nevertheless, game theory is really fascinating, and the complexity for which people make decisions on quite basic bits of information is kind of really interesting. We spend lots of time measuring, interested in paranoia, so measuring the extent to which people think their opponents' decisions are motivated by things like harmful intent or self-interest, or what changes that, whether they're in-group or out-groups, and so on. You can also use online experiment platforms. So we've heard about Gorilla, other platforms are available. So CogniLab, which has not launched to the public yet, also has a horrible data retention clause, so when you use it, they own your data, by the way. LabVance, Testable, and so on. So they're really sleek. They're beautiful, as you've seen from Gorilla. They're just really friendly. You can do loads of really cool stuff. They handle data really well. They're about mid-place on the cost scale. So, probably for a study with 500 odd people, you're talking about, I don't know, 2 or 3 grand, including participant costs and so on. Easy to use, and they scale with technical competence, right? So if you're a coder, you can get stuck in with a code and so on. One of the difficulties is currently inter-participant coordination is either non-existent or basic. I think only LabVance allows you to do this, but it doesn't do things like queuing. So if you've ever played an online game, one of the things you'll know is really important is if you want to play with someone at the same time, you've got to both be on at the same time. With online games, what you normally do is you press go and it goes matching a participant, and then it looks for another participant, syncs you together and launches. I think it's LabVance to allow you to do this, but they don't do that. So what it means is you can only use that in a lab where both people press the button at the same time. And if you're doing online studies for social interaction, that's pretty important, right? And it turns out that some of the basic stuff that game software does is really essential for these sort of experiments, and a lot of these platforms don't. The experiment can only, this is kind of one of the questions I asked for Nick from Gorilla earlier on, the experiment can only be copied, replicated or reproduced as long as the company still exists or doesn't obsolete the study. In other words, the reproducibility and the distributability of your experiments entirely rest with that company kind of being in existence. Lots of the companies will tell you that, of course, this isn't a problem and they'll stay in existence. But just to bring this really home in sharp relief, look at those 4 companies. Think how many of those are going to be around in 5 years' time, right? So that's your data, your experiments, your lab's work invested in a company that may not be here. Now, whether that's going to be realistic or not, actually the solution is to be able to get that code and run it independently, but currently none of those companies offer that. That's a real problem for us because we only run open science with distributable stuff, right? Free software, so platforms like SciToolkit, JTOS, O-Tree, allow you to kind of set up a server, the framework to allow you to kind of run these studies and so on. Programming libraries, they typically need you to be able to program and set up and run a web server. I used to be a network engineer before I was a psychologist actually, and it's got a bit easier, but it needs you to know Apache Linux and things like this. Social interaction possibilities can be good, but they don't often handle participant queuing and dropout, right? So they're better for lab studies than they are for recruiting off online samples. And you just can't run them off mturk because it won't queue for you, and then loads of people will drop out, complain, it'll cost you a load of money. The other alternative is a custom platform. In other words, paying a software company to build a platform for you or modify one. It's extremely expensive. So we costed this into a grant. Actually, we had a grant, and the original money was to hire a programmer. This was a real pain partly because of UC. So most programmers don't have doctorates because they're not idiots. They don't go, hey, I could, we had to really go through HR to just the basic thing of like, how do we pay a programmer this much when they haven't got a doctorate? And they were like, oh, well, you only get paid this much if you've got a doctorate. So eventually we got UCL to allow us to pay someone a postdoc salary, right, for a programmer, and we got a big, we put the advert online and we had one applicant. Because we're still paying half of what a programmer gets, all right, to do this work, basically. So in the end, we used that money to employ a software company to build it. Now, what you think as an experimentalist is good value for money, and what a software company thinks is good value for money is very, very different. So what you want is the ability to deploy, kind of like experiments and manipulation and changes and flexibility and things like that. Actually, a lot of what you're paying for a software agency is things like, kind of code reviews, is the consultancy process, is doing stuff, that's really important, like solid participant queuing and things like this. But what you get for your money is much, much less than if you would spend it on these platforms, all right? Because they've already done that for you, basically. So I'm going to show you a platform that was built for us called Social Lab. It cost us about 40 grand. It's really quite basic. But it gives you a lot of flexibility at the design stage. This is really important. So when at the design stage, you're kind of like God, right? You can kind of specify and they can go, we can do that, and then it takes them ages and so on, but you can do it. Once it's done, getting it changed either means you need to know how to program in whatever it's programmed, or you have to pay them whatever it is, 100 quid an hour to do that work. All right, so and the planning stage, as you know, if anyone's ever done an experiment, is challenging because a lot of the things you don't know are problems aren't problems until you do them. The good thing though is that it's fully reproducible. All of the code is open, so all of this was done as open source. So we could take that to any other software agency and they could continue working on it, or you could continue working on it, a PhD student could continue working on it. One of the difficulties is that capacity is limited by server resources, right? So this was built to run off, you can kind of have a metal box under your desk, which I have, but most of the stuff these days is done in the cloud. In other words, virtual computers and virtual databases and so on, and most software companies will just plug stuff into that because they just scale, right? So if there's 100 users and you need more RAM, you can just have a service where it will just take up more RAM and then they'll charge you for it afterwards. But what this means, if you're on a limited running budget, it just means you're capped at the amount of people you can run at once. So for example, on the genuinely interactive stuff we run, we can only run about 50 people at once, I think, in parallel. So this is Social Lab. It's kind of a bit basic. It's a bunch of game theory games. There's also one which is like chat interaction. Crucially, it's randomized. What we're really interested in for this bit is in psychosis. Often people get bothered by illusory social agents, right? So someone knocks their bins over and they think it's the CIA. And we're interested in how good are people at distinguishing human from computer agency. And the only way you can do that is randomize people to either a computer or a human, yeah, and see how accurate people are. So what you need is lots of other humans, and you need something that randomizes you. Yeah, and so this is exactly what this does. So we can get people to play game theory, stuff, Prisoner's Dilemma, a whole range of things. We can set bonuses and the like. We can do it where you just chat either to a bot, the world's leading chatbot called Misuku, or to randomise you to a real person, and then it asks you to judge whether you're playing against a human or a computer, and it looks at this in terms of your paranoia scores, and it looks at, can look at a whole range of things. So just stuff like randomisation and connecting people and bots and stuff like this is a hard software engineering, right? In terms of our thought processes, randomization is like one thing, but actually randomization in terms of software and syncing and so on is a challenging task. This was modified actually from an online platform called Otree, which is one you install yourself. And you know, it's kind of good in that it's based on Otree, so we can use some of those things. But you know, essentially, there's a lot of proper software development that's gone into that. We've talked a little bit about sampling. Just to reiterate the point I made earlier in one of the questions, there's lots of studies which show that the reason I got into online testing is because I read studies. I was like a lot of people who went, rubbish, people are just there kind of like, you know, smoking fags and looking out the window and stuff like this. Actually, almost all of the research says that you know, online samples are equal or better even than lab samples. There are some few known biases, so we know MTurk samples are kind of younger, more educated, somewhat more socially anxious, more liberal, more white than the general population. However, you look at these population studies and you need to think they're more representative or less representative in comparison to what? So it turns out that online studies from MTurk, for example, are more representative than undergraduate psychology students, but they're also more representative than if you went round, this is the States, right, went round knocking on doors for members of the public in college towns. And in fact, the only thing that seems to be more representative of the general population than online panel studies are formally sampled epidemiological studies. So for us, they're really helpful, right? In other words, they're not like formally sampled, purely representative studies, but they're considerably better than most kind of lab studies, even if you went out into the public and knocked on doors. We've shown this ourselves. So this is a lot of our studies I've done with Nicola have been on paranoia. So this was a study done in 2005. So this was a non-clinical population tested online. I think there were about 8,000 people. This is what the distribution of kind of paranoia looks like. This was a study, this was part of the British Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, which is a formally sampled epidemiological study that aims to be completely representative of the British population, looking at paranoia, and this is the distribution we get from MTurk. All right, so I mean, you know, also Nicola, coming from a corporation game theory background, is very good at doing all of these kind of attention checks and things like this. Didn't you ask people kind of, one of the things that Nicola really taught me is, you get people to do the questionnaires and then you call them back like a week later to get them to do the task, right? Because then they don't connect the two things. There's no reason to you know, answer in a specific way on the questionnaires because it's not connected to any sort of screening, and you know, you can bring them back for a whole bunch of different tasks. We asked, was it age and gender on a bunch of occasions?
I think we always do that, and then we have done things like ethnicity and
right.
Done perceived subjective socioeconomic status.
Right.
As well.
And when we test people over time, the correlation between age, when we ask them at time 1 and time 2, is like 0.98.
Oh, they're very consistent.
Yeah. So, you know, for the folks who, and you will get this, folks who say, oh, people could be typing in anything. Yeah, they could be, but on the whole they don't, which is kind of the thing I've really learned. One of our big issues is publication issues. So remember, we're kind of trying to submit to mental health and psychiatry journals. They're just massively biased against online studies. It's really frustrating. So we submit to clinical journals and they reject our pre-registered open data, open science, you know, kind of studies with like n equals 2,000. And then you open the pages of the following issue and they've got n equals 30, you know, kind of 20 variable sort of studies. I think this is partly due to the bias of clinical work, where clinicians tend to be biased towards clinical completeness. All right, you should do a thorough assessment of each person rather than statistical reliability and robustness. But me and Nicola have kind of got to the stage where we actually think not being desk rejected is a kind of success. So this was study conflict and cooperation and paranoia, large-scale behavioural experiment. Was this for n equals 2,000?
Yeah, just over.
Pre-registered, open data, all the materials online, all the analysis and things like this. This was a typical desk reject we got. You might consider a general psychology journal, that's an insult in mental health research, by the way. You might consider a general psychology journal not sufficiently connected with psychotic disorders for us, and we also worry on online surveys without reliability validity checks. Not an online survey, it's an experimental study. We do validity checks, we do reliability checks, but you know, this is kind of typical for us. So we know that when we do one of these studies, basically we just kind of plug away at journals until someone makes a mistake and accidentally sends it out. So at least I was talking to Jenny earlier on, she said not a problem at all in the field she works in. But at least in clinical domain, it's a real problem actually. So just to be aware of the different kind of biases and things like this in your field. So future online experimental platforms slowly adding interaction, has to be said. However, the business model currently prohibits reproducibility, all right, because their business model runs on them having a platform for which they own the code. I don't think this is necessary. I think it's perfectly capable to do something where you can take the JavaScript stuff somewhere else and they can be the service which is hosted and organized. However, that's currently the case. Game development platforms, really interesting to hear Alex's talk earlier on about Unity. Actually, I've been looking at kind of other software stuff. There's loads of online development platforms for game developers, right? Indie game developers, which do interaction and things like this. There's currently no answer to the convenience, cost, technical ability required trade-off, right? So you have to choose at the moment. Open science is the future. Online studies are part of it, but clinical journals are currently really cynical in the face of the evidence. Thank you very much.